Thank you everyone for joining. And we've got folks from all over, at least when I looked at the attendee list. So appreciate your commitment, appreciate your passion for a very important topic, obviously, which is ethics and professionalism. I just want to provide a little bit of context. This really, the purpose of today's discussion is really for you. And that is very intentional, both the comment period and these very explicit webinars, you're one of two that we're going to conduct, are really an attempt, an earnest attempt to make sure that this is an inclusive process that represents the full family of 14,000 people around the world. So before we get to that, though, I want to provide a little bit of context on the journey as to how we got here. First, I would say, as a professional body, we think about ethics all the time. Unlike a degree program at a university or a certificate program in an educational setting, a professional designation incorporates both the academic pursuits, but also this sense of community and professional social contract to each other and to your clients. And so when you think about belonging to something like CAIA, it's about this higher calling that has behavior and commitment and client-first mentality and fiduciary mindset, in addition to having the technical capability. And so that's always the kind of the thrust of much of our work, and certainly it has been the catalyst for this discussion and this revision. For 22 years, we have had the benefit and the blessing of counting and depending on CFA Institute's Code of Ethics. They've done a tremendous job of really charting the course for what a professional designation should look like, what a Code of Ethics should look like. And as we modeled much of the early stages of our history and program around the CFA program and CFA Institute, that made complete sense. A lot of the early charter holders of CAIA were also CFA charter holders as well. And so there was a lot of kind of overlap with both the markets we were serving, the model of the organization, and as a result, certainly the ethical responsibilities. But we're 22 years in to that history, and a couple years ago, we began this discussion and dialogue internally about whether it was time to kind of mature into our adulthood, if you will, as an organization and launch our own Code of Ethics and expectations. And that was really driven off of two main evolutions in the industry and with CAIA. The first was really the evolution of alternatives generally. Now, if you've heard us talk publicly and recently, we actually like to suggest, ironically, that CAIA is in the business of taking the alternative out of alternatives, meaning that these are now mainstream. 15%, we understand on our numbers, of the global investable universe is now allocated to alternatives across both hedge funds, kind of the first vintage of alternatives, all the way through every flavor of private capital. And that is obviously occurring at different paces throughout the world, but every region of the world is pursuing that. In certain institutional capital pools like endowments, it's over 50%. Sovereigns are maybe in the 40s, pensions in the 30s. And it's really only the wealth management high net worth family office that is still at the earlier stages of that. So my point is, we only expect this 15% to go higher. And so alternatives are no longer alternative. Everything is an alternative, as we like to say. And as a result, these portions and segments of the market are very mainstream and yet very different than conventional public equity and debt. And as you know, your experience, your pace, your rhythm in the marketplace, the dilemmas you face, the ethical responsibilities, the client demands, have variations and differences from those that manage long-only portfolios. And so that was part of it, is that the industry has changed, become more diversified. And the other thing that I've already alluded to is that from a CAIA maturity perspective, 14,000, we felt like we needed to address the fact that we've got individuals within that family, within the global charter holder community, that cover a broad range of activity across a much broader range of asset classes than has ever been the case. And so as a result, a prescriptive set of rules that perhaps was born out of the traditional public equity and debt maybe no longer applied, or was less applicable, we should say, than it has been in previous decades. And so we thought about this idea of embarking on the development of a modernized set that would be more principle based. Because of the diversity of who we're serving, it had to kind of rise up in its orientation from prescriptive rules to something that was more of creating a fiduciary mindset or an ethical environment that had some degrees of freedom on interpretation based upon exactly what your roles and responsibilities were, but still had enough teeth that gave us credibility as a professional organization that, again, we were bound and aligned around this higher calling of serving clients and the public good. So that was really the dialogue and the epiphany that occurred over the last couple of years. So then as we actually entered the process, we put together and composed a small working group of members, diverse members around the world, to kind of help us think through the scope of this. What would be some of the categories? How should we go about managing and facilitating the process, of which you are part of now? And then we also actually contracted with a thought leadership group called the Thinking Ahead Institute. For those of you that don't know the Thinking Ahead Institute, they are the arm's length thought leadership arm of WTW, the huge global consultancy. And they've done a lot on fiduciary responsibility and the kind of greater societal role of institutional capital allocation. And we felt was a very worthy and like-minded partner to help us draft this outline, this first set that you are here to help us refine and think through today. And so that's been the last 6 months or so, has been that process of actually starting to take that original dialogue and epiphany and actually start to put a draft to paper and a structure and an outline to paper so that you could then come back and comment on it. So that's where we've come. Just quickly before I hand to Steve, who's going to facilitate our open discussion where we want to spend most of the time hearing from you. Let me just give you a quick marker as to where we are in that process, where we go from here. So as I already mentioned, this hour is one of 2 webinars where we'll be having discussions. The open period for comment still will exist for another 60 days approximately or so. We'll take all of that feedback, both live from you guys here, as well as through the comment structure that we've got online. And all of that will have to kind of use our mosaic theory, as we say, to kind of filter, prioritize, and ultimately refine some of that work and that outline before we get to a point where we've got a late stage draft. We'll then go back to that same working group of members. Again, that is a good representation of the larger global family, run that by some of those changes. And then this will become part of your attestation as members in the 2025 cycle. So that's April, May, call it, of 2025. This will be the code of ethics that you sign off instead of the previous candidate and member agreement. This will then replace that. Of less importance to you as members, but just as an FYI, in parallel, Steve, as the head of curriculum, is also going to be working to massage and extend a lot of application and vignettes and examples of this outline for purposes of adding it to the curriculum, the candidate curriculum. And that will take place in October of 25. So you will see it first as members, and then ultimately it will enter in a little over a year into the candidate curriculum for testing and examination in 2026. So that is a lot of timeline, a lot of logistics, but I just wanted to make sure we were all on the same page as far as where we are in this journey. And so with that, Steve, I'll give it to you for some opening comments and to facilitate any dialogue, which I look forward to.
Thanks, John. So just as a reminder to everybody, feel free to put any comments or questions into the Q&A form here in Zoom. And by all means, obviously, reach out to us through our website or LinkedIn or email us if you have ideas that come to mind after this webinar. Just before we get to any questions, I want to just add a couple comments too, to level set and add some perspective. John mentioned that we had a global working group of CAIA members take a look at this and help us prepare this. And I want everyone to keep that in mind, that we are a global organization operating across 100 countries, and that the perspective on ethics and code of conduct can vary from one country to another. Cultural differences can inform and contribute to how people act and behave professionally. And so you might read through this code, and some of these principles may feel uncomfortable to you. They might, for some folks, they might feel like they haven't gone far enough, and for others, they might feel like they've gone too far. And so one of the challenges that we tried to navigate was thinking about what is representative of CAIA from a global standpoint, and recognizing that we may have some members that look at this and think that we could have gone further, or maybe feel like we've gone too far. And it is going to be an impossible task to satisfy everybody and make everybody feel comfortable. But we recognize that, and ultimately, if you're a little bit uncomfortable, that may be okay. And it's something that we ultimately have to accept in this process. Our goal was to be a leader in defining ethics and code of conduct, and putting together a set of principles that we believe are important for all professionals to adhere. And so in some ways, being a leader means you're going to do some things that might push folks a little bit further than maybe they were ready to be pushed. So I want to just kind of give that context as well for folks to consider and think about when they're looking at this. And so with that, I'll take a moment to see if there are any questions or comments from folks in the audience before moving forward with any other thoughts.
And we're asking them to put that in the chat box. So please do enter your thoughts there. I think maybe to lead and press and nudge a little bit, a couple things maybe to think about as you've looked at these 8. One is everything there? Do you see the guardrails of what you define as a professional, even if they don't apply to your current job responsibility as acutely? Do you see everything covered there? We want to make sure we have the full scope. Secondly, what are some examples or perhaps clarifications about what you see and how it applies to certain situations? That would help us as Steve writes these applications and case studies, you might call them, ideas for how this plays out and is brought to life in the real world would be really helpful. And then third, Steve mentioned a really good calibration. There's a sense which is in professionals, and the needle we're trying to thread here, which is to a large extent, this should be reflective of current practice and expectations. It shouldn't look unfamiliar. There's also a sense in which it should press and push and confront all of us a little bit, right? To rise and to elevate our practice. And so have we hit that correct calibration too? If this looks like a layup, we probably haven't reached high enough. If it looks completely unrealistic, then of course we've reached too high. And so we've got to find that balance too. So maybe a few other cues to think through some of your questions.
And one last point that I just want to emphasize, I know John already touched on this, but we've intentionally chosen the word principles here. And this is not necessarily to distinguish us from the CFA, which calls itself a code, but just something to point out is one of the things that we wanted to be mindful of is to try to step away from some of the very sort of strict rules or ordering that can come into some codes. And does it really matter if you, to use an extreme example, save a document for 6.5 years versus 7 years? Am I acting unethically if I shred my document at 6.5 years rather than at 7 years? We wanted to kind of eliminate some of that element that's maybe not arbitrary, but is maybe missing the point, and removing the opportunity for ethical and professional judgment, and have people focus on the bigger picture items about what it means to act with integrity, act professionally, and behave ethically. And so our principles, therefore, for some folks may not seem like they have the as clear a guidance, if that's the right way of putting it, or a set of standards that you might be more attuned with or used to. But again, there was intentionality around that to try to simplify the document to a certain degree, and also entrust our members that they can embrace and understand and exhibit what it means to act, behave, operate with professionalism, integrity, ethical conduct, and so forth, and not have to spell it out so strictly and step by step in lots of cases. And so again, that might make some folks uncomfortable. And to a certain degree, again, going back to feedback, as you look at these, if you do believe there is a spot where clarity is essential and necessary to define a concept or a principle, we certainly welcome that feedback. And our goal is to try to make it clear what it means to act with integrity without having 7 layers of rules underneath it. But we certainly can understand if some folks may believe that there are specific principles or examples of principles where they'd be enhanced with greater boundaries or guardrails than maybe would be exhibited in the existing document. Well, John, I think we may have preempted all of the questions that folks might have had, or I know that there's a lot for people to kind of think about, and I know everyone wants to be very thoughtful with the feedback they provide, and so there's no impetus to give questions now that, as John mentioned, there's still almost 60 days for folks to sit on this, think about it, contemplate it, and still continue to give us feedback.
Yeah, it doesn't, absolutely, it doesn't need to be now. I'd encourage you all to take a close look and really reflect and digest those and be thoughtful and forthcoming about what you agree with, what you don't agree with, what's missing. And that can either be with direct emails to Steve or I, or through the landing page on the site that has a form that we have created for your benefit to submit some of those. And that'll be a little bit more systematic for us to collate all of that feedback. So that's probably the ideal situation, but any way that you'd like to bring feedback, we'd be thrilled to accept it. So we won't belabor it if you need more time, but we really appreciate you tuning in. And anything else to close us with, Steve?
Look, I really appreciate everybody's interest and participation. Ethics may not sound like the most interesting topic, but I would argue it's probably the most important element of being a professional and being a charter holder, part of a professional organization. And so I really appreciate everyone taking this seriously and thoughtfully and contributing. It's I think the number one thing that we as an organization need to really promote and recognize as being an important part of the industry.
Indeed. All right. We look forward to hearing from you. And thanks again for your membership and your engagement. Take care.
All right. Take care.